Welcome to another post-coronavirus video lecture on sociological theory. This lecture is probably the first of two on Emile Durkheim's division of labor and society, just, really one of the great standards of classical sociological theory. I'll try to at least get through the end of book one in this video, and then I'll try to wrap up the rest of the book in a second video. So, Durkheim always divides his, I'm using the old Hall's translation, which is just available everywhere. It's basically in the public domain these days. But let's see. So Durkheim always divides his books up into three books, which is sort of a bizarre thing. So the first one is where he outlines the two basic types of solidarity in society, where the famous distinction between mechanical and organic solidarity is made, and where it's linked into different kinds of law, and then the consequences of that are sort of spelled out. So this is a pretty quick read. There's a lot of material in here, but a lot of it can be kind of skimmed. So I'm going to try to get through, really it's the first 150 pages fairly quickly. Then we go into the second book next time, which will be on the causes and conditions of the division of labor. And then really the punchline of the whole book occurs in the third book on the abnormal forms. So one of the things that, many scholars don't really pay that much attention to the third book. And when you do, you realize that Durkheim is no conservative. I mean, he's really a kind of radical thinker who's looking at, sort of a dramatic change in the operation of capitalist societies in order to make them function better. So it's really that third book where he's looking at the abnormal forms of the division of labor, where he's actually critiquing actually existing capitalism, right? So the first two books where he's sort of talking about the positive consequences and the positive features of a society based in a division of labor, he's really constructing something like a Weberian ideal type, a sort of image of what a good division of labor would look like. And then it's in the third book where he's contrasting the ideal, the normal variant of the division of labor against the actually existing abnormal forms that exist. So anyway, that's what we'll be doing here. So again, this will focus primarily on book one. I thought maybe like the best way to get started would be with a bit of an overview, and we'll try to come back to this again at the end of this lecture. So this is sort of a summary of book one of the division of labor. And what I've tried to capture here, so this is what we're going to do today. We're going to look at what happens to society as they shift from being rooted in mechanical solidarity, similarity due to likeness, into organic solidarity, bonding together out of difference, complementarity, and the fundamental need for other people's labor, right, which is organic solidarity. So, the simplest societies would be like a horde, which would almost be a pre-society, a sort of Darwinian horde or a Freudian horde. And then a clan, totem, tribal society would probably be the next sort of level of decreasing mechanical solidarity and increasing organic solidarity. So clan, totem, tribe, then onto a village, and a village sort of marks sort of that transition point from a society almost, primarily bonded together mechanically into one primarily bonded together organically. So the village and the town look alike. You might, like today, visit a village and visit a town and not be able to tell much difference, but they're bonded together very differently. So the village-town distinction becomes really important here. And it's something that he really doesn't develop very much until he get right to the end of this of book one. So then you look into more modern forms, that are pure or, closer to pure organic solidarity, cities that are always tied to a surrounding hinterland or country, right? The rural, the city, and then the rural area that it dominates. The metropolis, which really becomes kind of a global city, and then on into full-blown global modernity, right? And so as you go from societies that are small hordes, clan, totem, tribal societies, into sort of medieval villages, and then you just make that shift into the quasi, or the early modern town, cities, metropolis, and then global modernity. You move into a world where the world is bonded together, society is bonded together out of difference, out of complementarity, right? As opposed to these simpler forms of society that are bonded together out of similarity. So, this first book then sort of outlines some of the major sort of dimensions of the division of labor and the way that it matters. So, really fast, social density. He'll talk about social density. Social density is sort of the combination of population density and something like cultural diversity. So the more diverse a population, the greater the social density, because you have different gods, different ways, different mores, different different ways that are coexisting right next to each other. And then so it's dense population coupled with dense diversity, cultural diversity is social density. And then so you move from very simple societies that have low social density to high modernity, which has very high social density, right? Places of incredibly compact, nodes of population with incredible levels of cultural diversity, right? All right, social and moral vacuums. So Durkheim argues that traditional societies are really held together often by a kind of invisible barrier, a kind of, build that wall, but not a wall that's physical, it's a wall that's moral. So there's usually some kind of xenophobic out-hating of difference and a kind of barrier to intercourse of various kinds with people who are different from you. So you wind up with a culture that is unified as opposed to being very diverse. So societies that are bonded together with mechanical solidarity, bonded together out of likeness, must be isolated from each other. And that if they come into close contact with each other, they tend to trigger warfare, because each mechanically bonded society views its way as the one right way to live, and that any other society that comes into contact with it is going to commit sacrilege, which is going to trigger the impulse to purify, the impulse to go to war, essentially. And so you have to keep mechanically bonded societies separated by moral vacuums, right? These barriers to social intercourse, to communication, and to exchange of ways. You basically have to treat each other like you do not exist, right? And in the modernity, there are no moral vacuums, right? I mean, we really have to engage in political and economic and social intercourse with almost everyone, right? And so social vacuums go away. So that means that this is one of the main reasons why Durkheim argues you simply cannot have a mechanically bonded society in the middle of modernity, that they can't hold up, that there's just no way that you can sustain similarity without having isolation, right? Okay, the division of labor then becomes this is sort of the main independent variable here that Durkheim is going to analyze. And so in traditional societies, in the small hordes, villages, clans, tribes, relatively low, maybe even no division of labor, very fixed division of labor. So gender is going to be really, really rigidly fixed. Men and women are going to do fundamentally different roles. The young and the old are going to do different roles, and so on. And that these things are not going to vary. They're very fixed. And in the modern world, of course, you get a detailed division of labor, and the division of labor is going to be constantly changing. Okay? All right. The consciousness that dominates in mechanically bonded tribal societies or traditional societies, villages, clans, tribes, a collective consciousness, the consciousness of the group, the consciousness of the collective, right? Dominates thinking, dominates action, dominates moral reasoning, and so on. And in the farther you go into organically bonded modern society, the individual consciousness tends to take over. The dominant law, Durkheim makes a lot of this now, that in traditional societies, law is criminal law, that you try to expiate or purge or purify the negative consequences of crime. Crime is considered a sacrilege. It's a violation of the sacred order, and it requires some kind of purification ritual, generally in the form of punishment, and generally that involves the suffering and even the death of the violator. Right. So so it's crime and punishment, with the sacrilege as the focus. More on that in a little bit. Law then in modern society tends to be what he calls contract law or restitutive law. So it's you basically are bonded together through contracts and the performance of the obligations of the contracts, and that if one violates the contract, then one has to pay damages or some sort of restitution, right? Some sort of way to make people whole again or right again after the violation of the law. We'll go ahead and get rid of this and just finish it up. The dominant social unit in traditional societies, what Durkheim calls a segment. So it's like a segmented worm, or like we looked at last time in Marx's writings about the peasants, and that peasants are like potatoes in a sack, that each potato is like a segment. It's a self-contained unit, and it's relatively separated from and has little intercourse with the other small villages around it, right? That there's a kind of social vacuum separating them. So the dominant social unit in the modern world is an organ. So organization is really what this book is about, that the modern world is organized. That means that the society is divided up into specialized units, specialized agencies, specialized institutions, specialized organs, right? So, farmers versus merchants versus bankers versus religious people versus various kinds of crafts and trades and so on. And that each of those is an organ, and that each of them performs a function for the social whole in the same way that, like, the organ of the heart and the organ of the lungs are different, but nevertheless contribute to this larger social whole. So Durkheim argues that, a world of segments, each, again, like Marx said, each of the potatoes in a sack doesn't eat the other potatoes, but that once you get into a world that's organized, each one of the organs fundamentally needs the other to survive, and that the death of one organ can lead to the death of all. And so you get this really tight, high level of morality because each organ needs the other. There's a kind of reciprocity of need, and a kind of reciprocity then of value, that there's a recognition that each organ is sort of important. So in the modern world, there tends to be more latitude granted to people to be different, to move independently and so on. Whereas in the segments, in like a village, a clan, or a tribe, there's much less individual latitude, and each of the segments stays out of communication with the others. All right, so the dominant cultural mode in traditional societies, in those bonded together mechanically, is the sacred or the religious, right? So things that are set apart, like the god or the totems, or the priest or something, that becomes the dominant mode, the dominant way that culture is organized. So it's essentially religious mode. In organic modernity, it's really rationality, reason, instrumental thinking, that kind of stuff, and then a secular mode, right? That religion becomes one specialized organ within a larger organic society, whereas in, a village, religion dominates everything, right? Okay, temporality in traditional societies, in those bonded together mechanically, because things are fixed and can't change, because there's not a lot of cultural contact and so on, you really have a kind of cyclical sense of temporality, right? That each year you go through the same ritual order, ritual cycle. And that in modernity and in organically bonded society, because there's change, because the division of labor is detailed and it's going to ever be evolving, you wind up with a linear or progressive notion of change. So, culture is cyclical and conservative. You don't want change. Change is bad. Change is disruption. Change is anarchy. That's mechanically bonded societies. Change disrupts our sacred order. But in the modern world, change tends to be viewed as progressive. There's a linear sense of time. There's no expectation that today will be like yesterday, and that tomorrow won't be different, right? We expect things to change. All right, so what is the primary guarantor of solidarity? Well, in mechanically bonded societies, Durkheim is going to tell us it's ritual. So ritual worship of the collective representation, the collective type, as he calls it here in this, is translated in this text, the collective type, which really means a kind of god or a totem, or some image, some representation of what the totality of the group really is and what it stands for. Well, that thing then is sacred, it's set apart, and then sacraments or sacrifice is then the mode that members of a society get together, they ritually organize in order to feed and care for and honor and worship the thing that they've set apart, right? So that's what ritual worship is. And then the collective punishment of deviance is one of the primary guarantors of solidarity. That when a sacrilege is committed, the group comes together to ensure that the purification ritual, the expiation, the punishment is delivered upon those who violated the rule, right? So that's traditional, mechanically bonded guarantors of solidarity. Well, that doesn't work in modernity. In modernity, it's really contract fulfillment is the primary guarantor of solidarity. The fact that people come through on their contractual obligations. And that's guaranteed then by workplace ethics first, usually professional associations, unions used to fulfill this function. I'm a member of a number of these professional associations that have sort of like ethical standards and ethical guidelines. And that is supposed to be at least a first order guarantor of solidarity. Now, in the last instance, there's also a legal system and a police system that's going to ultimately be a kind of contract enforcement mechanism. So if in the traditional society, criminal law is going to dominate, the kind of criminal courts and the punishment of deviance, in modernity, something like tort law, civil courts, the collection of damages, these kind of things are going to be the dominant mode. Okay, so what you're really going to go then in the next few minutes, we're going to talk about the move then from basic hordes. So a horde, again, this is from Darwin as much as anything else, Darwin, Freud. Horde is sort of an almost pre-social, prehistoric group of primates dominated by a primal male, a kind of alpha male of some kind who uses physical force and direct physical contact to keep usually a group of subordinate men and women under their control. But you tend not to get much of a historical society or even something like law or even something like fixed language that develops out of this, because this is an incredibly unstable system. The lifespan of an alpha male in traditional or in prehistoric times might have only been 5 years, 4 years at most, right? And so this is an incredibly unstable kind of alignment and arrangement. And so the hordes are going to be constantly shifting and so on. So it's really almost pre-social. You get really the emergence of mechanical solidarity in a way that means anything once you get to totems, clans, tribes, right? And in that you get a society that usually divides itself up in halves, phaetries, or something like that, right? And that each of those halves is represented by a totem, usually totem animal or some totem plant, some natural force or natural being that half of the tribe or half of the totemic group identifies with. There's usually rules of exogamy. You're not allowed to marry anyone who shares your totem, so therefore there has to be a second totem, and then there's all these kinds of ritual exchange and so on between the two totems. So that's the clan. So that, and again, you separate these with social vacuums so that one clan, totem, tribal society isn't coming into close contact with another. The village, then, you get the same kind of thing where social vacuums separate villages. The center of the village is sort of, again, the collective representation, usually the god or a saint, often in old Catholic Europe, maybe the Virgin Mary in Catholic Europe, with a priest at the center of it, maybe a couple of elected officials or a couple of dominant local notables. And then the rest of the village members, there's often a kind of division of labor within a village. One person might be a miller, one might be a shoemaker, one might be work on spinning or textiles or blacksmithing or something like that. But the key about the village is that it remains as a relatively isolated unit. And so there's a kind of direct production of all needs within the village so that there's relatively economic interchange between the villagers and anyone outside of it. If there is any kind of interchange, it takes place within the village itself, right? Where you're doing trading and all kinds of things to make sure that So the division of labor is rudimentary and it stays within the village, right? What is produced in the village stays in the village. The big change then is the town. The town isn't any bigger than the village necessarily, maybe 1,000 people or something like that. but the town is fundamentally tied to other towns. Trade is central. So there's usually a wall around the town, a kind of defensive wall. There's a market at the center of the town. There's going to be a church as well. But the town isn't primarily religiously oriented gathering of people who only trade with each other, but there's always external trade. So there's a market, there's marketing, there's fairs, there's other kinds of routine ways for the produce of the town to find its way to a market. So you get something like what Marx talked about. You're producing for a market. You're producing to try to exchange to realize surplus value. And so there's that external trade. So this becomes a world of contracts, a world of trade, a world of change. It's a world of organic solidarity because everybody needs each other and you're going to be exchanging with the outside, and each of these other towns are going to be producing specialized goods, so you need them as well. And so you get, again, you get specialization. One town becomes a specialist producing salt, like happened in parts of Germany, right? Or one town becomes a specialist in crockery or ceramics, and another becomes a kind of specialist in producing beer or something like that. Not that would have happened, but anyway, you get these specializations. So each person within the town desperately becomes a specialist. Production for the market. They desperately need other people's labor, and then the other towns need your town, and you need the other towns. And so you get into this world of reciprocal need. You're bonded together out of difference, out of need for each other's specialized production, rather than being bonded together out of similarity. Right? Okay. And then cities. Again, are a development of the towns, a kind of increasing density of the town. The city is different from the town in that the city dominates surrounding hinterland or a country region, right? So they tend to be regionally dominant centers. And so there's always a trade from towns and villages into the city. So you get kind of the cities at the center of a spoke of trade, something like that, right? And so there's going to be a lot of trade that goes in there. But again, fundamentally organic. Everybody needs everybody else's labor. Nobody or very few people are growing all their own food or sewing all their own clothes or anything like that. We all need each other's labor by the time you get into a city environment. Then the metropolis is a sort of high modern extension of the city where you're not just dominating one region, but you really become linked into a global network of other metropoli. So you get all these, global cities, to use Sassen's term for these big cities with big banks, with big industrial trading, with transportation hubs, markets, and so on. So again, this is the world, very, very mechanical. From this side on to the village, you get sort of a transition point between the village and the town. They look alike, but they're organized differently. The village is inward-looking, religiously bonded, mechanically bonded. We trade with each other, but we all have essentially the same worldview. The town, you get the division of labor that develops externally, trading with other towns. The bonds there are organic, which means that you're bonded together out of difference and the need for other people in order to make a whole life. Cities, again, are a little bit more organically bonded together to surrounding hinterland. Metropoli bonded together to not just the rural area around, but to other cities and, again, the big financial centers. So this, then, to Durkheim, is essentially the story of solidarity. So what is solidarity? Solidarity is the force that binds, essentially, individuals or the units that make up society into society. It's the force that binds together. It's that centripetal force that overcomes the kind of centrifugal force of individuality and brings people together in a kind of coherent whole. So solidarity is this social force, the power, the social energy that makes solid, that makes whole a society, right? And to Durkheim, then, there's these two major kinds. There's organic solidarity and mechanical solidarity. So here, again, this is a little sketch of mine, but the mechanical solidarity is what exists in rural areas where you have each of these little villages, tribal peoples maybe bonded together by ritual, living in social isolation from each other, not doing a whole lot of trading with anyone else, being isolated, and then the metropolis, again, represented here by a high modern skyscraper. Everybody in that skyscraper needs someone to grow tomatoes for them. They can't do it themselves. And so you get that organic bonding. So mechanical bonding here, shared mindset, shared similarity, a kind of shared psychological profile, right? Shared beliefs, shared practices, shared rituals, shared notion of the sacred, shared punishment of those who violate our one right way to live. And then in modernity, you get organic solidarity, recognition of the need for individual rights, individuality, individual liberty, and then the recognition that each of us desperately needs other people in order to survive, right? If it gets disrupted, we cannot live. Okay, so that's the overview. So let's sort of jump inside the book. I'm going to use a kind of map I sometimes share with students. This is sort of my handwritten map of the book. We'll just work from it because it's quite honestly just easier for me. When I finish a map of a book, I often work from the map, not the book, unless I really care about phrasing and so on. And there's a few places that's true here, but not in general. So, Durkheim opens the book by talking about the fact that, in the modern world, we need specialists, that we no longer need Renaissance men or people who are generalists, that most of us, in order to be effective and to find a place in the modern world, have to specialize in some way, right? So well-rounded people are not what we really need. What we really need are specialists. And in order to be a specialist, in other words, to fight what he called, Weber and dilettantism, amateurism, in order not to have the world dominated by dilettantes who really don't know what the hell they're doing, right? We need people specializing and becoming a kind of expert at their one particular thing, right? And that the world works better. And again, just think of what that means. So this is what organic solidarity is. Organic solidarity is the kind of recognition that other people will need my specialized labor. If I become a specialist in one thing, teaching sociology or auditing corporations or painting cars or raising hogs or whatever the thing is that I specialize in, I have to have confidence that other people are going to need my labor and the produce of my labor. I'm going to be able to find a company that will hire me as a specialist, right? That's what organic solidarity is. It's that recognition of mutual need of each other's labor, because each of us are different and we're bonded together out of the mere fact that none of us are complete human beings, right? That none of us are a kind of social whole in and of ourselves. We're all little parts, and that we need the collective. We need to sort of combine ourselves into a larger universal, right? Or at least a larger particularity in order for us, our individuality to be realized, right? We die without each other. We're in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic. Very few of us would have been able to survive for more than a few weeks, no matter how much of a survivalist we were, no matter how much of our basement was full of survival food or something. You would have run out quite a while ago. And so we needed each other's labor. And so that kind of that basic notion has become pretty clear now. All right, so Durkheim then argues that the division of labor in the modern world doesn't just make us economically efficient. He claims it bonds us together in very, very in a kind of effective way. And he argues that many people criticized modernity, capitalism, as being a fundamentally immoral system, not because of the reasons that Marx claimed, that it exploits workers and so on, but because it leads to immorality. Right? So this was like the big religious critique of modernity. Cities are full of crime. Cities are full of immorality. Cities are the place where people lose their faith. Cities are the place where crimes and sins are everywhere, right? Those the flesh pots of the city, right? And so and there are places where there's a lot of suicides, there's a lot of crimes, and so on. And so the argument is that Durkheim is going to tell us, look. The division of labor is actually a moral force. It's a good thing. It bonds us together more tightly than any mechanically bonded society ever did. And that's going to be his argument, that we shouldn't fear the modern world. We shouldn't fear the modern world. We shouldn't fear a world of specialization, individual rights, science, education, learning. We shouldn't fear free exploration of ideas or creative pursuit of unexplored facets of life, right? We shouldn't hate pioneers and explorers, right? We shouldn't fear that, because in the end, he argues, this is a moral world, right? The division of labor leads to organic solidarity, which is morality. Okay. All right. So then he argues that really there's two bases then for solidarity. There's similarity, like, right, birds of a feather flock together, or complementarity, right, that you need to have harmony and difference, right? The idea of deep calling to deep is the similarity. The idea of harmony and difference, or opposites attract, is the notion of complementarity. So he talks about marriage. Marriage in many ways is, we think about it being, homogamy, that people tend to be the same race, they tend to be the same religion, even the same social class background, same education level, and so on. But as he says, in the end, marriage, at least as it was conceived of in late 19th century France, heterosexual as all get out, right, was ultimately rooted in complementarity. Man versus woman, public man versus private woman, the man of the salary, the woman of the nursery, that kind of thing, right? Okay. So, all right. So then he goes on and he talks about other things. We'll just sort of leave some of that out. So he's, but the division of labor does, page 21, leads to increased productivity. The more you divide things up, the more productive things become. And that means that as you become more divided up, you also increase the bonds with other people. You need other people more. And in order for you to be effective, the more specialized you are, the more dense the bonds need to be to others, right? You need other people for more and more things. So as the division of labor in the modern world develops, it increases the bonds linking person to person. Again, in the writings of Marx, each one of those potatoes in a sack was an isolated potato. But in the modern world, the division of labor means that we have to exchange. We have to be complementary of each other. We have to allow each other to be individual, to become good at what we do. And then, so the idea is that we actually have to harmonize across difference, right? So if, I often think in musical terms here. So if mechanical solidarity occurs when there's a kind of, a group of people singing in unison, the trick of modernity is to get this unity or harmony in difference. So something like, chords and, harmonics, complex harmonics, even, resolutions, chord progressions and so on. But you wind up with a kind of a dense layering of harmonic social order. Okay. All right. So page 24, Durkheim argues that law is the distillation or crystallization of morality. And so this book is actually, ultimately, this first book, at least anyways, is a study of comparative law. So I really like that idea that no legal system can exist if for long, if it runs counter to the moral order of society. In other words, if the informal culture doesn't support the law is ineffective. Look at prohibition. Or if if the moral order isn't supported by law, it tends to dissolve fairly quickly. So these two things go together, law and morality. One is a crystallization, a formalization, a written version of the other. One's formal, one's informal, one's written. One is just sort of carried in the wispy, thin strands of society. Okay, so chapter 2 then is about mechanical solidarity or solidarity by similarities. So he's going to make some big claims here. Again, this is a world of repressive law, criminal law, right? We're trying to repress, keep down crime, law and order in Donald Trump's terms, right? And it means we're focused on punishment. So there's usually strong, emotional, passionate ignition of people's outrage. Crime isn't just something that happens that you got caught. But this notion that if you're doing something that's against the moral order, the criminal order in a mechanically bonded society, people are outraged. There's lynching. There's collective action, right? Retribution, that kind of stuff. That's meted down on people who dare violate the sacred rule. So it's held together by ritual, by ceremony. Page 32, by taboo, right? Eating meat. And, this is crucial. Yeah, eating meat, touching an animal. Letting a fire go out, not sacrificing at the right time, not celebrating in the right way, right? The regulation of ritual, of etiquette, of ceremony, right? Of religious practices, that this becomes every bit as important as something like killing people, right? So on page 34, crime is not things that are harmful to persons, right? They're instead they're things that disturb the collective consciousness, disturb the moral order. So when people get horror, outrage, shock, oh my God, disbelief, outrage, how dare you? Let's kill them, right? That kind of thing. It's the feelings that are shocked, right? The moral order that is shocked. And so we're living in a time right now where again, 195,000 people have died of coronavirus in America as of this moment, and there's much less worry about that than there is about, like a killing of one police person, or even like there was all this outrage very recently about Nancy Pelosi, the 80-year-old woman who is the majority leader in the House of Representatives in the United States, got a haircut, and it was like big time news and outrage and moral, how dare you, for getting a haircut, as opposed to failing to intervene effectively while 195,000 citizens die, right? So it isn't the magnitude of the actual harm that's done that signifies a crime. It's the magnitude of the disturbance to the collective consciousness, the amount of outrage, the consciousness that gets disturbed, right? All right, so every healthy consciousness then shares the same moral sensibility, and when that is disturbed, that's when people get agitated. So you're living in a world of collective consciousness when people vibrate to the same moral tune, and when an act causes the same sort of reaction in a broad group of people. Okay. So these strange little violations of the ritual order can sometimes lead to more outrage and punishment than killing a whole bunch of people, genocide or something, right? So penal law then specifies punishment for a crime. It doesn't explain the rationale for it. There's no sort of reason for it. It just is, I say unto you that thou shalt not do it, and by God you don't do it, right? And so crime is something that just is wrong because it's wrong. Thou shalt not, and thus it is so, right? So punishment is emotional, not reasonable, and then it's sacred and untouchable, and so on. So the more primitive the society, page 36, you can say the less developed might be a more a palatable way to put that. 130 years after Durkheim wrote, probably less developed society, developing society, and all law is criminal law. So you're in a relatively undeveloped society, a mechanically bonded society, when all law is criminal law. When thou shalt not, with criminal punishment attached to it, right? When it's prohibitions that, if violated, then lead to punishment, that is a mechanically bonded society. Okay? All right. So repressive law tends to be diffuse. You don't have to wait for a policeman if you commit a crime, and you usually get a passionate reaction. So, we know, like in the American South, the color line was absolutely loaded with social energy. We know how in the 19th and 20th century how, white American Southerners were outraged. Emmett Till was killed in America because it was claimed that this teenage boy had dared whistle at a white woman, right? And that outraged the relatively primitive, in this sense, primitive, whites in the American South, who then, killed him out of outrage, right? So again, it wasn't that he didn't kill anyone, but he outraged that collective sentiment. So it's diffuse. No one called the cops. He was killed, right? So you get this collective punishment of deviance. That's the essence. Purging, purifying, often with a discharge of violence that is unmodulated, that isn't, tightly coupled to the severity of the crime. It's just, often quite excessive. And there's usually, again, it's physical punishment, and suffering is often, as a kind of way to purge, to purify, right? So it's ritual collective punishment of deviance is one of the main signifiers of a very traditional or mechanically bonded society. So collective sentiments then are behind punishments, criminal punishments. And they're not only written upon everyone's mind, but deeply written in their heart, right? This intensity of feeling, strongly rooted. They're slow to change, right? That kind of stuff. So penal law or criminal law is also religious law. It's sacrilege, right? And so then you get this culture that's very, very, page 38, very, very conservative, unchanging. So page 38, crime then requires uniformity, definiteness, right? Very, very narrow definition, concreteness, determinateness. So you wind up with a kind of a rigidity, an absoluteness, a clear boundaries between right and wrong. And when you violate those, again, you get the full force of collective sentiment coming against you. So page 38, 39, again, is his summary of the chapter. So individuals pass on, but the collective consciousness abides. I just love that phrase. It's like the dude abides, the collective consciousness abides, right? So, so this leads to a psychological type of society. The sum total of social similarities is what society is. So, just a little drawing here. So, so you get then in a traditional mechanically bonded society, you get a bunch of people who are like-minded. There's a collective type, a collective representation. A collective image that then shines in front of the people, and that becomes the kind of archetype for behavior, the dictator of right and wrong, and so on. And so the collective consciousness, so each person's consciousness is essentially a mirror reflection off of the collective, right? This collective representation. Something like a god, a totem, or something like that is in mind, and then the violation of sacrilege leads to collective punishment. So there's a very tangible sense of where the boundary between right and wrong exists, right? So he's page 40. A crime is a crime because we condemn it. It's not a crime because it hurts someone. It's a crime because it's a crime to the collective consciousness. Because it's condemned, it's a crime, right? So an act is not socially evil because an act is socially evil simply because it is rejected by society, right? All right. Let's forget about the crimes against the collective consciousness. So there it is. So primitive people, this is Durkheim, punish for the sake of punishing. It's an emotional reaction. They do not aim to punish fairly. There's no effort to be fair. There's no effort to be just. There's simply an effort to punishment. It's an emotional reaction, a kind of release of pent-up energy, a release of frustration, a release of fear, a release of anger, right? A desire to purge, to burn, right? So they punish for the sake of punishing. They punish for the sake of punishing. They can't hold their society together without punishing. Can I underline that? You know you're in a mechanically bonded society, a society that lacks developed organic solidarity, when people punish for the sake of punishing, and when the society cannot hold together, the collective consciousness cannot hold together unless there is punishment. We must punish. We must find someone to punish. We must ritually punish people who violate our collective sentiment. If we don't do that, we don't realize it. So in the same way that Marx wrote about the way that you had to realize the value of a commodity as reflected off of another commodity, in a traditional society, you have to realize the collective consciousness by punishing those who violate it. It's only when reflected off of that passionate suffering, that passionate, violent attack on a perpetrator or someone who's imagined to be a perpetrator, that the collective consciousness is realized, is made real, right? So the passionate feeling that lies at the heart of punishment dies down when it is spent. Feeling remains after punishing the offender. It keeps going. So there's an excessive quality to this, right? So this is, the law of the talon. I'm working on this book in economic theology. This is the backcountry law, the law of the talon, which is, here's the talon, the eye for an eye, the tooth for a tooth law, vengeance, passionate vengeance, blood vengeance, right? Okay, so then he goes on about again, punishment is always an expiation, a discharge, a purging. And again, and then he argues again on page 46 or so, small ritual violations, small ceremonial errors that are made en route to a ritual can lead to complete outrage that requires punitive violence meted out on someone, right? So it isn't the amount of damage that's actually done to a person. It's the damage, the disruption in the collective consciousness. And remember, the collective consciousness is always looking. People who are mechanically bonded are always looking for somebody to come down on. They're looking for an opportunity to be offended. They're looking for someone to be outraged about, right? They're seeking this out. They're seeking out an opportunity to be violent, okay? Page 47, shame is a doubling of punishment, right? Disgracing, humiliating the offender, right? You get a sense of shame. we've been offended, right? We get offended, and so then that tends to increase the punishment. So page 48, it is society that punishes. It's society that does it. So we are the agents of it, the individuals who like engage in hangings or again, sort of collective violence are doing it, but it is society that punishes, right? The essence of society is religious, and the moral sentiments are in collective consciousness are at the core of religions. The offenses against the gods are offenses against society. So this is sort of the famous Durkheimian view that gods are really the collective representation of society. In the great that Mark Worrell wrote this, a great line from the sociologist Mark Worrell, that when when an individual looks in a mirror, it sees a self, and when a society looks in a mirror, it sees a God. That a God is simply the way that society sees itself, right? They don't have good mirrors, right? We haven't really developed anything like a mirror that allows the society to see itself very effectively. In many ways, that's what a census is, or what sociological analysis is. But whoa, it's a God, right? Look, it's a God. Let's look in our mirror. There, my God, there's a God, right? So gods then are spiritual projections or doubles of society. That's Durkheim. It comes from Feuerbach. By the way, that's not your God. Your God's the right one, the only right one. Everybody else's God, though, is the one that fits the Durkheimian mode, right? All right, so page 50, there's a list of minor religious improprieties that are treated as sacrilege, right? All kinds of little things that lead then to this total reaction of passion and so on, right? Okay, so let's just really fast then. Let's look at this. So mechanical solidarity, collective consciousness. What is collective consciousness? Collective consciousness is literally shared moral sentiments. Human beings are sort of bolted together at the brain, bolted together at the level of belief. They see the world the same way. They get triggered by the same kind of offenses. They want to ritually worship in the same way. They don't want to be individuals. They want to be a member of a society. So mechanical bond, think of mechanical bonds like in boat building. Mechanical bond is like literally a bolt and nut together that holds something together, as opposed to a chemical bond, which is just glue. Mechanical bonds are bolts. So think of mechanically bonded societies are those that are bolted together at the level of consciousness, right? There is no individual consciousness. If you have individual consciousness, you're sinning, and we're gonna kill you. Collective consciousness, we're bolted together. There is no individuality. So you move as a group, you think as a group, you react to crime as a group, that kind of thing, right? Generally, this is one of my little sketches, but societies can't see themselves, right? So they tend to look into the face as something like a collective type. So imagine that there was a society, that had, that was seeking for a collective representation, a figure that represents them, whatever that collective type is. Then the collective representation, the God, the hero, the sacred hero. The intercessor between the sacred and the human, the divine, and so on. That is how society sees itself. So society can't directly, members of a society can't directly look at each other and see the society above them. Instead, they look at each other and they see themselves as distributed souls of a shared God, right? So the God is really the representation, again, in Durkheim's terms, of the people. So there's a bit of a sacrilegious quality here. Sorry about that. But I think the idea comes across, right? That this is Durkheim's theory of religion. Gods are society projected out and represented in a way that members of a society can understand. And the way that collective consciousness then operates, the way that it becomes realized is through the rituals that honor that collective type, and then the punishment in the name of that collective type. Okay, so it's real fast. I use this image when I teach Durkheim's Elementary Forms of Religious Life. But, the collective type then is sort of the focus of ritual, and that members of a society see each other, and they see the group honoring the totem, and that realizes the totem. Or they see other members of the group punishing someone who violated the rules of the totem, and that makes the totem real, right? So the collective type, the collective consciousness, is realized in the ritual order, okay? This is the world's best image I ever found of mechanical solidarity. It's this image. I'm sorry, I cannot remember where this is. Maori people, possibly New Guinea. I'm not sure. But these men are dancing in a ritual. They're animating a collective type. They're members of a totem. We'll just say, I don't know if that's actually true here, but they're dancing in such a way that no individual could stand in that posture and dance in a circle for very long, right? Unless you have incredible leg strength. So the posture that the men are adopting is inherently collective. They fall as individuals, but they can stand and dance in a circle for an extended period of time only when they're bonded together. So they're kind of bolted together at the level of the legs and the arms and so on. And then again, the minds are bolted together as well in a mechanically bonded world, right? So again, this is a visual representation of the physical bonding together. There's a kind of action here that's not possible for individuals to engage in. It requires the collective. And the same is true then of the consciousness. The consciousness that animates this conduct is shared, and individuality is something that is relatively frowned upon. So, any image of tribal peoples or of indigenous peoples, for some reason, explorers just love to take, to make drawings and to make representations of ritual. And so you often see these circles and these ritual orders. This is a very old and quite racist actually image of I think it's like a 17th century image of but again, that kind of ritual order that you're getting together to honor a collective type. Again, these are all 19th century images. Again, probably quite racist in the way that they're represented, but just that sense that in a mechanically bonded society, the ritual order is the way that the society makes real the collective consciousness, right? The collective consciousness is wispy, thin, and spiritual, right? But it's made real, it's made tangible, it's objectified, and realized through ritual. So again, more images of a ritual order, right? Okay. Got another image of a ritual order. So these are going to get old to you, but I've got one more. Yeah, this is a South American tribe. Here again, where you're donning a kind of costuming of the collective representation. So you're animating, again, in Goffman's terms, a social mask. All right, and in contemporary religion, so this is an image, a very famous image of the Shakers, the 19th century, the double distilled Quakers, a kind of pietist group that, oddly enough, didn't practice sex, but practiced these bizarre rituals of intergender dancing. And anyway, their ritual order was also an affirmation of something like their collective consciousness. These were really, really powerful capitalists. I mean, Shakers were amazing capitalists and very, very inventive people, great entrepreneurs, but they also shared a collective consciousness, and the ritual order was the way that they affirmed, made real, made visible the collective consciousness of the group. And again, remember, collective punishment of deviance is a way to realize and make real the collective consciousness in sacrilege. So, infractions then are sacrilege, and they require suffering and violence. So here's the foot caning in Turkey. Here is a beheading underway in I believe this is in China, 19th century image. Again, infractions are sacrilege and require suffering to purify, to get rid of the negative consequences of the purification. Okay, so there are a bunch of images of mechanical solidarity. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on then. So, okay. Yeah, so, we'll try to get down to this. So on page 53 on, he starts writing in terms of moral energy currents, something that's really powerful. The sociologist Mark Worrell makes a lot of use of this in his work about recognizing that societies are built of moral energy, and what Durkheim argues is that in a world of in the modern world, you get these opposing states of consciousness, right? You put a whole bunch of people together at a shopping mall or a tourist location. There's going to be all kinds of cancellations, right? Some people are going to be angry, others are sad, some are agitated, some are tired, and so on. There's not going to be a lot of coordination of energy currents, but in traditional societies, especially when there is either a ritual that honors the totem or the sacred, or an act of sacrilege that requires punishment, that's when you get an alignment of the states of consciousness. So you're in a mechanically bonded society that has a kind of mechanical collective consciousness when people get outraged at the same things or when they celebrate the same things, right? When they honor the same thing and when they want to punish and kill the same thing, right? So say in our society, honoring, there are groups of people in America who honor President Trump as something like a sacred being, want to wear clothing that signify, MAGA hats. They want to go to rallies, which are almost like a religious event, a cult almost. And then a kind of a ritual punishment of people who are on an opposing side, or again, migrants or liberals, I suppose, those kind of things. So you wind up with these energy states then, and in the same way that what Durkheim argues is that you're in a mechanically bonded world, you can actually get a magnification, and that you get this heightened sense of emotionality, and he calls that collective effervescence, the fever of the moral energy, right? So if I'm angry and you're angry and 1,000 other people are angry, the collective anger exceeds the initial anger, and we're actually ignited by the energy of the other people around us. So I'm at a level 3 of anger, you're at a 4, someone else is at a 7, and it jacks me and you up to a 7, right? Well, I guess we are outraged at that. My God, by God, we need to get really angry about this, right? Okay, so it jacks up the moral temperature, that kind of stuff. So you get more conformity, more mechanical solidarity, again, as you get uniformity and as you get that offense against a collective conscience that really bothers people. Okay, so sacrilege, punishment, that kind of stuff. Tearing with the sacred, page 58 to 63, really bothers people. Okay, it's really society, page 64. We'll sort of leave that off. Okay, then chapter 3 is where he differentiates mechanical bonded society, the society of shared similarity, to the society of difference. So that's the division of labor, right? Organic solidarity. So again, farmers in a primitive society all have the same, like peasants in a traditional society, all have the same walk of life, the same beliefs. They're in a village, they live together, they do the same thing all day long, the same sheep. And then as you get more modern, you get a division. Some farmers become miners, they become shopkeepers, school keepers, priests. They become, merchants. They sell Doritos. They do all kinds of things. And then as you move into modern society, you get this fully developed world. So no peasant really needs the other peasants. We all grow our own potatoes. We don't have our own sheep. We don't need each other. But as you begin to get more division of labor, again, the schoolmaster needs to have food, and the children of the farmers need to have education. The miners need to have food, So you get all this exchange. So you get organic solidarity. So what's organic solidarity? It's the bonding together out of complementarity. It's the recognition of the desperate need that we have for other people's labor. Okay? So it's sort of the moral order of the modern world. I need you. You need me. I can't survive without you. And neither one of us can survive without 1,000 other people doing 1,000 other jobs. We have to give each other freedom to be able to do the job and to be able to be the people we need to be to get our jobs done. And that's modern society, right? It's where the sacred order gets sort of turned down. The collective effervescence around religion is reduced. And then the amount of energy that people place into learning a specialized task and kind of, submitting to the discipline of a job well done, right, becomes the essence of the modern world, exchange and that kind of thing. All right, so then this is the world of what he calls restitutory law, not punishment. You're trying to restore. So it's really about contracts. It's contracts, not crime, right? The criminal isn't expiated. You're not trying to harm the person who violates a contract. You're just trying to get damages out of them to restore the person who was damaged, right? You're not trying to punish. You don't want them to suffer. You just want there to be the person who was harmed made whole, right? So it isn't about punishment. It's about making whole the person who suffered the contract violation. All right, so the criminal world then is emotional, criminal law, collective consciousness. It's diffuse throughout society. The suffering of the offender, punishment. It's traditional, it's religious. There's the notion of sacrilege. The collective consciousness is always invoked. But in civil law, contract law, right, it's unemotional. We don't get outraged if someone violates a contract in some way. We just say, well, pay your damages and let's go have a beer, right? It's contract ordered, private, focused, specialized. So you're not collective. It's a specialization. There isn't a suffering of offensive, rather it's a paying of damages. This is a modern as opposed to a traditional way to live. It tends to be kind of economic, and especially economic damages as opposed to religious punishing, right? Contractual obligations to support a sacrilege. That's the primary way that you deviate or that you trigger sanctions. It's a world of contract. You fail a contractual obligation. Traditional society, you commit a sacrilege. And so, again, the sacrilege lies at the center of the collective consciousness, but the civil contract violation is outside the collective consciousness. It's just part of the contractual order. So page 71, a very famous line: if a contract has binding force, it's society that gives it that force. Okay? So there's something like always has to be a society of organic solidarity underneath contracts. So again, here's where he goes on and he talks on around page 84 between an individual consciousness and a collective consciousness. So just imagine every person in the same way that you have a first name, that's your individual name, that's you, an individual name, and you have a family name as your second name. Imagine that you have a collective consciousness, your family consciousness, your village consciousness, your tribe consciousness, right? That's your collective consciousness. Link that to your last name. And then you have an individual consciousness linked to your first name. In traditional societies bonded together by punishment, collective consciousness, and mechanical solidarity, the collective consciousness dominates the individual consciousness, right? A tiny, tiny little individual consciousness that doesn't really matter that much in a massive collective consciousness. In the modern world, this gets reversed. You have a tiny little collective consciousness, right? And a large individual one. So in a traditional society, you really don't have much room to move. Who your parents were, who your family is, who your extended family is, who your clan is, determines everything. In the modern world, who your family is, unless you're from a very wealthy family or something, or a notorious criminal family, your family doesn't have much impact on you. So your individuality tends to matter more. Now, we in sociology study how race, class, gender wind up blowing this away, and we realize that actually we are really held bound by our family of origin. But it's not because of shared consciousness. It's because of the structural arrangement of society. So in the modern world, the individual society, your first name dominates your last name, something along those lines, okay? All right, so organic solidarity makes individual consciousness strong. And so I think this is the essence of the thing. So what does it look like? So I have some images here. This is the single best image I've ever seen of organic solidarity. So this is an image of a telegraph pole about 1880 or so. And you can just see all these immense number of lines. So before telegraph or telephone lines were buried, they were strung in cities on poles. And that meant that, every business was connected to all other businesses with a telegraph line. And so you could see just how many businesses, how dense businesses, or the connection between businesses were by seeing the density of the lines. The lines were literally the network connections linking businesses to businesses. That's organic solidarity. I need to exchange. I have a specialized a company that does a very specialized thing. I have clients who do all kinds of other things, and I have to buy supplies from all kinds of other things. Then I'm an individual. I still need to feed my family. I have to do things like, get underpants and Doritos, and so I've got to be able to find, that as well. So that's organic solidarity. I'm specialized. I have to have connections to all these other people who are specialized, and then we all are dependent upon each other for our future. Okay, so there's all these images that you can find these things all over the place. What cities looked like before they buried the cables underground, right? This is organic solidarity visible in front of you, right? The immense network of ties linking, companies to companies, businesses to businesses, trades to trades, and so on, right? Okay, so that's organic solidarity. Okay, so chapter 4, one of my favorite chapters in the book, it's an analysis. He should have this chart. It's not in there. It should be. So page 92 to 99, he talks about different legal systems over time, and he argues that you can tell whether a society is developed or not, how modern it is, by the percentage of law that is criminal versus contract. And so the argument is that if you're living in a society that's 100% criminal law, you're in a mechanically bonded society, a primitive society in his terms, or a developing society in ours. If you're living in a society that has, say, 1/3 or fewer laws that are criminal, then you are in a relatively modern society. I talked to an attorney when I drew this up, and I asked him, what percentage of what percentage of law work in Iowa would be billed out for crime versus contract. He said it would probably be about 1 to 3, or something like that, right? So it would be no more than 1/3 of legal work, legal billing, legal employment in Iowa would be in crime. Most of it is going to be contract. So very primitive societies, 100% criminal law. So this is the percent. The vertical axis, percentage of law that is repressive or criminal. The horizontal axis is just simply these different societies. So primitive societies, 100% criminal. This is the Pentateuch. This is the Old Testament. Thou shalt not. All the prohibitions that are in there and against seething a calf on its own milk and that kind of stuff. You understand that. The Old Testament. It's about, say, 95% criminal. The law of the 12 tables, which is the law of Rome, right, was about 50%. So Rome was much more advanced, much more modern than, say, the ancient Judaic law of Israel. The Salic Franks, after the fall of Rome, went back to nearly 100% criminal law. So the fall of Rome really was a loss of civilization. So the law of the 12 tables is, we'll say operative at about the birth of Christ. The Salic Franks are, say, 900. And then the Burgundians have a little bit more development. The Visigoths are a little bit more development, and then Iowa's a little bit more advanced than the Visigoths with about 30% law. So he's arguing, law is an index of social solidarity. If you're living in a world that's all crime, and if you're all worried about crime, you're pretty mechanical. If you're living in a world that's all about contracts and meeting our contractual obligations, being specialized, honoring other people's specialization, honoring the work that other people do, recognizing that you need other people's work, that's modern organic solidarity. Okay. All right, so then chapter 5, the increasing preponderance of the division of labor. So he just says that the farther you go into the modern world, there's going to be more and more and more of that. So page 109, crimes disappear in modernity. He's got this amazing little chart in here. It's on like page 107, where he's looking at different rules that would be rules forbidding acts contrary to the sentiments of the collective. So this is going to be collective consciousness, negative and positive. And then this is going to be the sentiments around, this is organic solidarity on this side, right? So, I think. No, this is still, I'm sorry, this is all mechanical solidarity, like murder. That this is all collective consciousness. So this is all the different phases or types of crime. All right. So page 111, in the modern world, then, again, we no longer kill for adultery. We no longer kill for a disobedient child, right? That you could kill your child or you could beat your spouse. If you were a white man, at least anyway, you could certainly kill your servants, your serfs, your slaves. And that all goes away. We know that there are parts of the world that were covered by crime in traditional society that are covered by contract now. So he talks about family law, that family is it's decreasingly criminal, and it's increasingly covered by civil law. So there's a total disappearance of religious crimes, page 111. We no longer, we don't kill people for sacred ceremonies, violating sacred ceremonies. We don't have blue laws anymore. Most states allow all kinds of business to be open on Sundays, even religious holidays. So the farther we go then, the farther we go into modernity, the less and less sacrilege that there is, okay? So you do away with like burning at the stake and that kind of stuff. And so modernity and the kind of division of labor and difference and diversity and the need for very, very different kinds of skills and talents, the need for other people's work means that we become quite tolerant of difference, we become liberal in that sense. And that dissipates this sense of sacrilege in the collective consciousness. So modernity, the division of labor, he says, creates something like modern morality. Tolerance, liberalism, individual rights, autonomous individuality. that kind of thing. Page 115, he argues that there are no new crimes in modernity, right? You actually get rid of a lot of crimes. You can elaborate different types of crimes, but there tends to be no new crime. It's only the existing classes of crimes that become more elaborated, right? No new crimes. There's only one new class of crime, and he calls it, it's really civil rights. It's a crime against the cult of the individual. So in the traditional world, you wouldn't have cared much if individuals were barred from developing in whatever way they want. In other words, if someone violates your civil rights and treats you as a member of a category instead of an individual, thereby constraining you and harming you, well, that's what traditional society was. So this becomes the only new category of crime in the modern world. Crimes tend to decrease, and then contract law increases. And the only new region of law then is civil rights, okay, the civil rights law. So the collective consciousness shrinks in modernity with the one exception of the cult of the individual, or the guarantee of civil rights. Page 118 and on, the foreshadows the elementary forms of religious life. Again, he's talking about religion, how religion begins to shrink, and so we'll kind of leave some of that out. In modernity, the collective consciousness is weaker. You're going to get a declining moral sentiment. You're going to get dissipation of moral energy. People aren't going to get outraged in the same way at the same things. There are very different kinds of Christian gods depending upon the particular denomination you're a part of, right? And so there are versions of Christianity and versions of Jesus that get outraged when social injustice occurs, when the poor aren't taken care of, or when black people aren't taken care of, or when Native Americans aren't taken care of, right? We get outraged at that. Again, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus. And then there are many versions of Christianity that are growing today that think that's just fine, right? The poor need to look after themselves, and instead get really outraged at gay marriage or abortion, right? Those kinds of things. So even within the world of Christianity and the Christian God and the Christian Christ himself, you get these very different moral reactions. So, in many ways, we're in an era of polarization where at the moment, political parties seem to be calling out people who vibrate according to the same, moral temperature. So in some ways, certainly on the religious and political right in America, we're kind of returning to an era of collective sentiments and anger and that kind of stuff. The violation of civil rights is probably the one thing that really unites the left in America. So this new category of law is something that most people on the left are really concerned about, civil rights. And that tends to be something that religious conservatives and political traditionalists don't care very much about, right? They much more care about things like gay marriage. All right, so the worship of the dignity of the human person is what happens with civil rights. So I'm sacred, you're sacred too, we're both sacred, right? We're all sacred, right? That's sort of the basic notion of civil rights and of individuality in the modern world. Okay, so on page 131, he then begins to sort of outline this theory of, again, this is chapter 6, the increasing preponderance of organic solidarity. So as you go, again, So again, he begins with a horde. A horde doesn't have any differentiation, no structure. It has Laban's group mind. It doesn't have anything, like a sacred order that sustains itself over time or language of law. So we can kick that out, and then you get into the tribe with the chieftain. On page 131, he writes about the collective consciousness maintains maximum energy in this form when you have a clan, a tribe that's bonded together with one chieftain. You really get a really, really strong collective consciousness that tends to overwhelm almost everyone, and then people really get caught up in defending that. People are willing to die to protect the group immediately, right? All right. Monarchy, patriarchy is part of this. Village and European feudalism. Page 131, you get the divine right of kings, the Pope. You get some differentiation here, right? You get priests and lords and all these different villages and common people. You get the Pope and the king. And so because of this differentiation, different saints that are viewed as sacred in different locations, the collective consciousness begins to dissipate and begins to spread out a little bit. And then you get to a village, and that's sort of the highest form of society that can still be viewed as bonded together with mechanical solidarity. It's the church that holds it together. The shared lifestyle, the fact that the division of labor only takes place within the group here and doesn't involve trade outside. The village that's surrounded by the social or moral vacuum that prevents contact with groups that have with a different notion of the sacred, right? And so this is what he calls sort of pseudo-organic solidarity. It's a group that trades only within itself, bonded together by one sort of ritual order. You still punish deviants. You still all worship at the same altar, that kind of thing. Then he goes on page 133 where he talks how organic solidarity progresses. Again, you go from clan, tribe, ethnic groups, ancestral specialization. That's all going on in the pre-modern world. And by the time you get to modern cities, society, the most advanced, the more simple, and societies are the most advanced, the more simple and simplified it is. I'm not sure what that is exactly. Sorry about that. You get the transition from the village to towns when you get to trade with other towns, so that you recognize the need for the labor of other towns, and you begin again to produce for a market, which means you need the work of others much more fully. So this is sort of the beginning of organic solidarity, the beginning of bonding together over likeness and over contracts and so on. Okay. All right. So the horde, the clan. Yeah. So traditional societies are segments. Again, the potatoes in a sack. They're segmental. So as a traditional society grows geographically or even with more population, it simply adds more villages, basically, or more tribes or more little totems. It doesn't change form, and you can lose half the population. The society keeps growing. In fact, you can have just one of these little groups go off and form a colony somewhere, and you basically reproduce the whole society, right? Religion provides the whole of social life. People are not individualized. They're really held together in these little segments, each of which is more or less a complete society unto itself. So page 131, the tribe, again, the emergence of the chieftain is the beginning of the specialization of an individual. The first individual is the chieftain. And then his sacred rights then become generalized with more organic bonding that continues as society becomes more complete. Page 135, you get the struggle between segments and organs. They're dialectically opposed. They negate each other. We moderns no longer really understand clan society or segmental society as an effective force in our lives. We don't have religious schools. Most of us tend to go to Republican schools, something that Durkheim helped design in France, secular Republican schools. So egoism and altruism as consciousness in the modern traditional societies, that's here. So chapter 7, then, page 141 to 171, he engages with Herbert Spencer. And the whole point that he says is, look, underneath any contract is a society. And that we can't really view the modern world as a society of contracts. It's a society of solidarity underneath contracts. So it's a society of morality rooted in difference, morality rooted in mutual respect, morality rooted in freedom of individual action, of instrumentality, right? Freedom to be instrumentally effective in doing the thing you do. So there cannot be one right way to live because we're all living differently. To be a blacksmith, to be a butcher, to be a baker, to be a farmer, to be a scholar, to be a retail worker, to be a political operative, to be a lawyer, to be, any of the things that, someone who works in a car dealership, someone who works for a city, working like for the waterworks, each being a mortician, having to touch dead bodies and work with dead bodies. Each of these requires a different set of skills, a different set of aptitudes, a different set of talents, and a different set of techniques that transcend the kind of ritual control of behavior and the kind of excitation of collective punishment and collective sacrament that was typical of traditional society. So we have to have freedom. We have to have liberal, something like a liberal order, liberal culture, freedom of the individual and the cult of the individual, civil rights, right? Okay, so that sort of brings us to the end. So page 172 to 174 is the summary of book 1. When I teach this book, like to my graduate students, we're doing this in one night, and I actually have them begin with book 2, where they just sort of read the summary, and I sort of pick it up from there. I hope this is helpful. I'll do one more recording on this to pick up the rest of the book.